Brenda Lafferty was beautiful, intelligent, and assertive. And those were some of the reasons why her brothers-in-law, Ron and Dan Lafferty, decided to murder her and her 15-month-old daughter Erica in 1984. Mormon fundamentalists claiming to be guided by God, Ron, and Dan insisted that they were driven to murder by a divine message they called the removal revelation. But the truth behind their motives was far more earthbound. Ron, who had received the message, was furious with Brenda for helping his wife to leave him after he embraced polyamory. This is the story of Brenda Lafferty, whose murder by Ron and Dan Lafferty inspired the book and TV show Under the Banner of Heaven. Brenda Lafferty was born on July 19, 1960, into a Mormon family living in Logan, Utah. She spent most of her childhood in Ithaca, New York, and Kimberly, Idaho, and enjoyed an especially close relationship with two of her sisters, Betty and Bonnie, who were around her same age. Beautiful, intelligent, and popular among her peers, Brenda used her good looks to secure a college scholarship from the Miss Twin Falls, Idaho, beauty pageant. She spent a year at the University of Idaho and the College of Southern Idaho before she transferred to Brigham Young University back in Utah. Brenda's mother had gone to BYU, and Brenda hoped to study broadcast journalism. There, Brenda also met her husband, Alan Lafferty. They quickly fell in love and married, and Brenda gave birth to their daughter, Erica Lane Lafferty, on April 28, 1983, after her college graduation. But Brenda's marriage with Alan was complex. Though the Wright family liked Alan, he could be controlling and didn't want Brenda to work. What's more, two of his brothers, Ron and Dan Lafferty, had begun to embrace an extreme form of Mormonism. They had joined a breakaway polygamous sect called the School of Prophets and started to preach it to their brothers. Ron's extremism upset his wife, Diana, who found that her husband suddenly expected a servant instead of a spouse. She confided in Brenda about the deepening cracks in her marriage, and Brenda encouraged her to take her children and leave Ron. Diana really loved Brenda, Brenda's sister, Sharon Wright stated, because all of the other Lafferty brothers had wives that they treated like second-class citizens. Brenda ended up giving Diana the courage she needed to leave. Diana took Brenda's advice, and Ron Lafferty would not soon forget it. In early 1984, shortly after the end of his marriage, Ron Lafferty claimed to have received divine instructions from God. Curiously, this revelation demanded that he murder people he blamed for his problems. Brenda, a woman named Chloe Lowe, who'd supported his wife, and a man named Richard Stowe, who had overseen Ron's excommunication from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Ron shared the message with his brother Dan and his brother Alan, Brenda's husband. Alan later testified that he responded to the message, which Dan and Ron called their removal revelation, with disbelief. I told him that God had made no such revelation to me, and I would protect Brenda and Erica with my life, he said in court. But Alan did not tell Brenda about it. If he had told Brenda about Ron's revelation, she would have been out of there in a minute, and she'd still be alive today, Brenda's sister, Betty stated. But Brenda didn't know anything about it. Indeed, Brenda Lafferty had no idea that she was in danger. And on July 24, 1984, Ron and Dan Lafferty put their murderous plan into action. Accompanied by two drifters named Charles Carnes and Richard Knapp, Ron and Dan Lafferty made their way to Brenda's apartment. While Carnes and Knapp waited in the car, they forced their way inside and began their attack. As Erica, 15 months, wailed from her crib, Carnes could hear Ron calling Brenda bad names and a liar, and the sound of the brothers physically beating her. According to testimony he gave at Ron's trial, the brothers strangled Brenda with a vacuum cord and slit her throat. Then Dan walked into baby Erica's room and slit her throat as well. I walked in Erica's room. I talked to her for a minute. I said, "I'm not sure why I'm supposed to do this. "But I guess God wants you home," Dan Lafferty said. Dan claimed that he killed Brenda as well, describing her killing like something out of the scriptures. But Carnes testified that Ron took credit for Brenda's death when he returned to the car. "I killed her. I can't believe I killed her," Ron allegedly said. The four men went to fulfill the rest of Ron's removal revelation, but their other victims escaped unscathed. Lowe wasn't home, and they missed the turn to Stowe's house. Instead, they kept driving toward Nevada. Meanwhile, Alan Lafferty came home and discovered the gruesome scene. "I went over to Brenda, and I prayed." Alan testified in court. He called the police. Alan knew exactly who had killed his wife and daughter. Ron and Dan Lafferty were arrested in Reno, Nevada, on August 7, 1984. They were soon charged with 2 counts of criminal homicide, 2 counts of aggravated burglary, and 2 counts of conspiracy to commit homicide. Dan was sentenced to 2 life terms in prison. Ron was sentenced to death, but died in 2019 before his execution. On February 24, 1986, 29-year-old Sherri Rasmussen was found dead in her apartment in Van Nuys, California. In a fit of jealous rage, an LAPD officer named Stephanie Lazarus had murdered Rasmussen after her on-again, off-again boyfriend John Ruetten ended their relationship for good and married Rasmussen. Furthermore, the initial investigation of Rasmussen's death is now believed to have been purposely botched by the Los Angeles Police Department to protect Lazarus, one of their own. This is the twisted story behind the murder of Sherri Rasmussen. John Ruetten and Stephanie Lazarus were both students at the University of California, Los Angeles, when they met and were both set to graduate in 1982. Ruetten was a mechanical engineering major, and Lazarus was studying political science. They were also both active and very athletic. Ruetten and Lazarus began a casual relationship, but were not intimate with each other until after graduation. Ruetten took a job as a hardware developer, and Lazarus became a police officer with the LAPD. Though they hooked up a number of times, they never made their relationship official. Later, Ruetten met Sherri Rasmussen, who was quickly rising within the medical field. She was already the director of nursing at Glendale Adventist Medical Center. Rasmussen and Ruetten bonded quickly, and soon moved into an apartment together in Van Nuys. Stephanie Lazarus, meanwhile, had a hard time letting go of Ruetten, and made herself something of a third wheel in their relationship, a situation that made Rasmussen uncomfortable. At the 25th birthday party Lazarus threw for Ruetten, he told her about Rasmussen, confessing that they were seriously involved. Lazarus, despondent, wrote a letter to Ruetten's mother in 1985. "I'm truly in love with John, and the past year has really torn me up," she wrote. "I wish it didn't end the way it did, and I don't think I'll ever understand his decision." Ruetten later testified that before he and Rasmussen got married, he and Lazarus had sex one final time so Lazarus could have closure on the relationship. Instead, Lazarus began hanging around even more. Her constant contact with Ruetten worried Sherri Rasmussen, but Ruetten assured her there was nothing more than friendship between them. However, Lazarus' infatuation grew stronger, and at one point she even came to Rasmussen's office to tell her, "If I can't have John, no one else will," though she still worried that Lazarus was stalking her. Rasmussen leaned into Ruetten's assurances, and the pair got married in November of 1985. They had 3 months of marital bliss before tragedy struck. On February 24, 1986, Rasmussen was debating going to work. She had an unexciting class on her schedule and decided to call out sick, using a recent back injury as an excuse. Ruetten left for work soon after. A few hours later, Ruetten called the house. When his call went unanswered, he tried Rasmussen's work, assuming she had decided to go in, but he couldn't reach her there either. He called the house a few more times to no avail. Ruetten tried to ignore his worries and continued his day. But when he got home from work, he found a nightmarish scene. He found the answering machine unactivated even though they activated it every day. He found a bloody handprint next to the panic button near the alarm, and the room was covered in broken objects. John Ruetten then found Sherri Rasmussen dead in the living room. She had been shot 3 times. A Los Angeles PD forensic specialist also found a bite mark on her arm and took a swab. The LAPD quickly ruled Rasmussen was a victim of a burglary. Though neighbors heard screaming and fighting, they did not call the police. Police surmised that the burglar was in the process of carrying out electronics when Rasmussen came upon them and the fight ensued. The police recovered Rasmussen's missing car, and the only other stolen item was the couple's marriage license. Ruetten was ruled out as a suspect and moved from Los Angeles after the murder. Rasmussen's father mentioned his daughter's issues with Lazarus to police, and a note was made, but the lead was never followed up on. Though the bite mark proved to be unusual, the case went cold as no suspect was ever identified. LAPD was too overwhelmed with the growing crack epidemic and related gang violence to dedicate the time needed for the investigation. But Rasmussen's father never believed that his daughter would not have been able to defend herself against a random burglar. Rasmussen's father tried for several years to have the case reopened. Later, detectives refused to do it, and it was not until DNA testing became available that the case gained new traction. A dedicated team at the LAPD worked old forensic cases, using the new technology, and Rasmussen's case was eligible. In 2004, criminalist Jennifer Francis found missing evidence from the file, the cotton swab with DNA on it. The saliva and bite mark were deemed to be female, proving the initial theory of a male burglar was not possible. But no detective took the case, so it again went cold. In 2009, the LAPD reopened the case. It was ruled a murder, with the burglary staged to throw police off the trail. Detectives eventually found Stephanie Lazarus' name in the notes from the original investigation and decided to pursue the lead. They collected DNA from a coffee cup Lazarus threw away while off duty and were able to match it to the sample taken from the bite mark. The evidence proved that Stephanie Lazarus was Rasmussen's killer, and she was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 27 years to life at the California Institution for Women. She has attempted to appeal her case several times, but the lower courts have upheld the conviction. A state parole board panel in November 2023 recommended parole for Stephanie Lazarus, who was convicted of gunning down her ex-lover's new wife in 1986 at the condominium where the couple lived in Van Nuys. The decision was made during the first parole suitability hearing for Stephanie Lazarus, and Rasmussen's relatives are outraged that the woman who hid the truth about the murder and continued to work as a law enforcement officer for more than 20 years could go free. The grant of parole is tentative and subject to review by the state's Board of Parole Hearings in a process that can take up to 120 days, according to the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. Governor Gavin Newsom could then allow the decision to stand, reverse the parole grant, or ask the full parole board to consider the issue. Connie Rasmussen, Sherri Rasmussen's older sister, said in her family's first interview about the decision that while Lazarus acknowledged killing Sherri during the hearing, she did not apologize to relatives and appeared to downplay the seriousness of the crime, saying that she hadn't intended to kill Sherri when she went to the Van Nuys condo on February 24, 1986. Mother's Day, May 12, 1985, started out like any other day, especially for America's military service members, many of whom were far from their homes and families. Phone calls and cards would have to substitute for visits and hugs while they went about their duties. Gradually, however, these dedicated men and women would learn that a horrifying tragedy had befallen one of their own. The wife and 2 daughters of Captain Gary Eastburn were found murdered after fighting for their lives. Grown men shed tears at the image of the lone survivor, a 21-month-old baby, standing, arms outstretched, crying out for her dead mother and sisters, crying out for someone. Katie Eastburn was used to going it alone. She was a military wife, after all. Her husband, Gary Eastburn, was frequently away this time. He was attending an Air Force captain in training school in Alabama. The Eastburns were excited about their upcoming transfer to Germany, even if it was a little nerve-wracking thinking about moving to a foreign country. But there was sure to be plenty of support. The military base to which they had been assigned was large and accommodating to its American service members and their families. Katie and the girls knew they'd miss their family and friends, but they were also heartbroken about having to leave their family dog Dixie behind. Strict regulations prohibited them from bringing the pet along. With a heavy heart, Katie placed a classified ad in the local paper that serviced the Fayetteville and Fort Bragg area, hoping to find a good family willing to take Dixie and love the animal just as they did. Around 9 p.m. on Tuesday, May 7, 1985, Army Staff Sergeant Timothy Hennis answered the classified ad. He and his wife, Angela Hennis, loved dogs, but their current pet was extremely jealous of their newborn daughter. Despite their best efforts, Snowball, a mixed breed, just wasn't going to work out. But they hoped they could find another dog, preferably one from a home with kids, which newborn Christina could grow with and enjoy. Dixie seemed to be exactly what Tim and Angela were hoping for. Before he left the Eastburn home, he asked Katie to use the restroom, and she obliged, no doubt comfortable with her husband's fellow soldier. Tim soon exited, thanked Mrs. Eastburn for both the use of facilities and Dixie, attached the dog to a leash, and started toward home, eager to introduce Christina and Dixie. It can't be said with 100% certainty how it all went down on that Thursday, May 9th, 1985. But what is known is that Katie Eastburn and 2 of her 3 daughters would die brutal deaths. On Sunday, May 12th, the Eastburns' next-door neighbor, Army Sergeant Bob Seafelt, had just bailed out one of his soldiers who had a little too much fun on Saturday night and landed himself in the clinker. When he returned home, he was greeted by a worried wife who had noticed that papers were piling up on the Eastburns' doorstep. The family car was still in the driveway, and the baby stroller was parked in its usual place by the back door. The more Bob thought about it, he realized he hadn't seen the Eastburns in at least 3 days. He decided a little investigating was in order. As he stepped up to the front door, he was certain he heard the cries of an infant. But his knocks and doorbell rings went unanswered. Returning home, he called the Eastburns' babysitter, Julie Zerniak, who came rushing over. Bob was waiting outside the Eastburn home when she arrived. Julie peeked into a window and saw baby Jana standing alone in her crib, arms outstretched. Reacting on instinct, Julie began looking for a possible way into the home. But Bob convinced her to wait for the arrival of police. Officer William Toman was the first to arrive. Forcing open a window, he retrieved the crying infant and a stack of diapers and handed her to Bob. Saying he smelled something horrible, he told Bob to stand by as he went to check out the source. Right away, he discovered the dead bodies of Katie and her 3-year-old daughter, Erin. Officer Toman called for backup. A full-scale search of the home found the body of 5-year-old Cara Eastburn, lying in bed with the covers pulled up. Area residents wanted to know, why would anyone kill a beautiful young mother and her 2 daughters? And the bigger question was, who could do such a thing? While investigators searched the home at 367 Summerhill Road for viable clues to identify the killer, a young man named Patrick Cohn reported that he had seen a man leaving the residence 3 nights ago, the night of the murders. Eager to solve the triple homicide, investigators listened intently as Patrick gave his account. I was walking home from my girlfriend's house about 3:30 a.m. as I was walking. I saw a white Chevette parked on the road. Then I saw this white dude walking down the lady's driveway. I passed right by him," he said. "I'm getting an early start this morning," or something like that. Then I watched him get in his white Chevette and drive off. Patrick then went on to provide a thorough description of the man, describing him as approximately 6'4" with blonde hair that peeked out from underneath a black toboggan knit hat, wearing a black members-only jacket atop a white shirt and blue jeans. 3 days after the murders, the police publicly broadcast via television and radio a request for the man who had answered the Eastburn's classified ad about the dog to please contact police. The plea was accompanied by a composite sketch created from Patrick Cohn's description. Timothy Hennis was watching the evening news when the investigators' request was reported, and was shaken by the similarities between himself and the composite sketch. Taking his wife and baby girl, Hennis drove to the police department in his white Chevette and offered to assist in any way possible. He willingly answered all of their questions without the aid of an attorney and never requested one. It didn't escape police how closely Tim Hennis resembled the sketch, or that he also drove a white Chevette. Although DNA was still a few years away from being used in criminal investigations, police requested hair, blood, and semen samples from Tim, the latter because Katie Eastburn had been raped shortly before her death. Tim willingly obliged, again without the advice of an attorney. Tim and Angela returned to their home, believing they had done all they could do to hopefully bring justice for the Eastman family. So they were shocked when investigators knocked on their door later that evening with an arrest warrant for Tim. No one involved, not police, Gary, or Janet Eastman, or the Hennises, knew that this case would occupy courtrooms for the next quarter of a century. Timothy Hennis immediately hired the high-profile Fayetteville law firm of Beaver, Holt, Richardson, Sternlicht, Burge, and Glazier. Two of their senior partners, Gary Beaver and Billy Richardson, were considered to be the best criminal defense attorneys in the state of North Carolina. Right out of the starting gate, the firm employed the services of a private investigator, Bob Nelligar. His job was to retrace the steps of police detectives, scrutinize the evidence, and look for information or clues police may have missed. Julie, the family's babysitter, was the first to be interviewed. She told Nelligar the family residence had recently been the target of harassing phone calls, some of a sexual nature. She admitted to her fascination with Dr. Jeffrey McDonald's case, her belief in his innocence, and her mail exchanges with the convicted murderer. She also admitted to 2 other important facts. Her stepbrothers strongly resembled Tim Hennis, producing photos when the investigator was skeptical, and that she had been assisting vice squads in setting up busts of local drug dealers. She believed that on one occasion she had been followed from the Eastburn home by an angry drug dealer, although she could not positively identify the man. Secondly, Nelligar and the attorneys set up a reenactment of the scene described by Patrick Cohn. Along with a Tim Hennis lookalike, they went to the Summerhill Road residence at the same early morning hour, with the same foggy and moonless settings, with video camera in hand. The Patrick stand-in was unable to see the Tim actor, as the area was poorly lit during the pre-dawn hours. During the reenactment, David Hill, a neighbor from across the street, approached the team and told them that, on the night of the murder, he had approached a van parked in front of the Eastburn residence. He had spoken to a white male sporting a crew cut who said he had stopped to talk with a couple of friends whose voices David could hear in the back of the van. A couple of days later, David saw the same van for sale in the Winn-Dixie parking lot. At a second reenactment that failed to prove the eyewitness testimony, Patrick, who was present at the request of investigators, admitted that he believed he was mistaken and that he had been having doubts about having fingered Tim Hennis for quite a while. Nigeler also spotted several flaws in the evidence, such as hairs and fingerprints found at the scene that could not be matched to Hennis or any known friend or family member of the Eastburn family. And the size 9 shoe print uncovered by police was entirely too small to match Tim's size, 13 feet. World-renowned forensic expert Paul Stambaugh visited the Eastburn residence 6 months after the crime. There he located a condom package undiscovered by police underneath the dresser. According to Stambaugh, when compared to known facts about the relationship between Mr. and Mrs. Eastburn, this suggested consensual sex had occurred in the home prior to murders, as it was his experience that rapists rarely carried condoms to commit their violent acts. Additionally, after spending several hours in the home and poring over reports and evidence, Stambaugh was of the mind that the murders were committed by 2 assailants. Neligar wrapped up his investigation by speaking with Charlotte Kirby, the newspaper carrier for the Eastburn route. Charlotte was angry at being questioned and refused to provide any information other than it was raining that morning, and she had to bag the papers. Charlotte agreed to testify, but only if she could do so anonymously. He also spoke with Lucille Cook, who had used her ATM card at the same time and same place as Katie's card had been used. She said she saw no one during her transaction. Lastly, Neligar spoke with Summerhill Road residents, Chuck and Sherri Rasmussen, who claimed to have gone out for an early morning walk at the same time Patrick Cohn said he had seen the man in the white Chevette. According to them, they not only did not see Patrick, but they hadn't seen anyone out at the hour. However, they said that a few nights later, they had indeed witnessed a blonde man with a crew cut, wearing a black beret and black members-only jacket, carrying a black garbage bag over his shoulder, walking down the street at the same time the Eastburn murders would have occurred a few nights before. Police and prosecutors, however, adamantly stuck to their belief in Tim's guilt. They badgered Patrick Cohn about his retracted identification of Tim Hennis, and prosecutor William Van Story argued that just because hair and fingerprint samples didn't match Tim didn't mean he couldn't have committed the crimes. On July 4th, 1986, after 12 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict on 1 count of first-degree rape and 3 counts of first-degree murder. Tim Hennis was sentenced to death 3 times. Just days after being booked into Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina, Tim Hennis received a postcard from a mysterious Mr. X that read, "Dear Mr. Hennis, I did the crime. I murdered the Eastburns. Sorry you're doing the time. I'll be safely out of North Carolina when you read this. Thanks, Mr. X." His attorneys dismissed it as a hoax, but kept the postcard on file nonetheless. The prosecution received an almost identical postcard but continued to downplay it, even when specifically requested in discovery motions. Tim's tireless attorneys continued to spend hours preparing and arguing his appeals. After more than 2 years of being on death row, Tim's conviction was overturned and sent back to the courts for a retrial, which began on February 27, 1989. This time, the prosecutor introduced a new witness, Elisa Peabody, a neighbor who had previously stated she saw no one on the night of the murders, but was now adamant that she had in fact seen Tim Hennis leave the scene of the crime. It was of little consequence to the defense, who had come to court this time with both guns blazing. They aggressively took on prosecutor witnesses such as Lucille Cook, the ATM lady who first said no one was at the machine at the time she used it, then later was firm in her memory of Tim Hennis being the person to use it before her. When she testified at the second trial that she remembered Hennis waiting a minute or two before leaving the ATM area, defense attorney used courtroom theatrics to demonstrate the length of a minute or two along with bank record timestamps to prove Lucille was lying. The state's star witness, Patrick Cohn, wasn't exempt from scrutiny when he was forced to admit he had been charged with theft, using a stolen ATM card, but had questionably been able to avoid being brought to trial. Cian Buckner, Patrick's friend, testified to having lost a wallet containing a letter written by his friend in which he admitted he didn't know who or what he really saw on the night of May 9th, 1985. But the defense saved their best for last. With the help of a new private investigator, T.V. O'Malley, the attorneys were able to locate the mysterious walker seen by Chuck and Sherri Rasmussen, and later by newspaper carrier Charlotte Kirby. Jaws dropped when John Raupash entered the courtroom after being called to the stand. John could have been Tim's identical twin brother. Jurors and spectators were stunned when John testified that he was 6'4", always wore a black members-only jacket, black toboggan, white t-shirt, and dark corduroy pants, and that he always carried his book bag over his shoulder. Following the presentation made by the defense, especially the appearance of John Raupash, it came as no surprise when Tim Hennis was acquitted on all counts. If Tim Hennis felt free after his acquittal in 1989, this was premature. In 2007, Army officials reopened the case after experts claimed they had linked DNA from the 22-year-old murder to Tim. By this time, 49-year-old Tim had retired from the military, but was forcefully reactivated to stand trial under military jurisdiction. Double jeopardy prevented state officials from retrying Tim. Even with the discovery of new evidence, the federal government is considered a sovereign authority unto itself and therefore separate from powers of the states. Although Tim initially stuck to his story of only visiting the Eastburns to claim the dog listed in the classifieds, he later claimed that he and Katie had consensual sex the night of the murder. He did not disclose this important fact before, because, according to Tim, he was afraid and did not wish to add to Gary and Jana Eastburn's grief. The military jury rejected Tim's claims and on April 9, 2010, found him guilty on 3 counts of premeditated murder. Tim Hennis is currently on death row in an Army facility in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. His attorneys are presently working on his appeals, which are expected to go on for years. In 2020, the United States Court of Military Appeals ruled to uphold the conviction and death sentence of Timothy Hennis. That same year, Hennis attorneys filed a writ for certiorari with the U.S. Supreme Court, but it was denied in January 2021. Even after the appeals process is over, Hennis cannot be executed without presidential approval. In recent years, that hasn't happened very often. The U.S. military has not executed anyone from its ranks since 1961. From the outside, it seemed as though West Virginia teenagers Rachel Shoaf, Shelia Eddy, and Skylar Nees were best friends. But on July 6, 2012, Shoaf and Eddy lured an unsuspecting Nees into the woods of Pennsylvania, counted to 3, and stabbed her to death. For several months, the teenage killers kept their horrific crime a secret. Then, Shoaf finally broke under the pressure and confessed to the murder, leading the police to where they'd hidden Nees' body. When asked why they killed her, Shoaf would say it was because we just didn't like her. Born on June 10, 1996, Rachel Shoaf seemed to have a lot of promise. Described by those who knew her as an adventurous and happy girl, Shoaf appeared to be thriving by the time she was attending high school in Morgantown, West Virginia. Shoaf had good grades, took singing and piano lessons, and was involved in theater. She also had 2 best friends, Shelia Eddy and Skylar Nees, and the girls did everything together. She loved life, and there was no reason for her not to. Kelly Kearns, Shoaf's close family friend, stated, "People around her loved her." Soon, however, Kearns noticed changes in Shoaf's behavior. The teen started sneaking out, skipping classes, and regularly smoking marijuana. Meanwhile, there appeared to be growing tension in her friendship group with Skylar Nees. In early July 2012, Nees' posts on social media seemed to hint that she was feeling excluded by her friends. "It really doesn't take much to piss me off," Nees wrote in one post on X, then known as Twitter, soon after. She wrote, "Sick of being at home. Thanks, friends. Love hanging out with you all too." The next day, she wrote, "You doing stuff like that is why I will never completely trust you." Chillingly, the following morning, Skylar Nees vanished. Shortly after midnight on July 6, 2012, 16-year-old Skylar Nees snuck out of her home in Star City, West Virginia to meet up with Rachel Shoaf and Sheila Eddy to smoke marijuana. Later, surveillance footage would show Skylar Nees entering Eddy's vehicle at about 12:35 a.m. Nees was never seen alive again. While Nees had apparently believed this would be a night out with friends like any other, Shoaf and Eddy had other plans. They had secretly brought along knives, which they'd hidden in their hoodies, as well as cleaning supplies, a shovel, and clean clothes to change into later. The girls smoked weed and drove around, eventually stopping in a remote wooded area just over the state line in Pennsylvania. Once there, Nees turned around to go find a lighter in the car. Then, Shoaf and Eddy counted 1, 2, 3, and literally stabbed their friend in the back, attacking her until she was dead. Afterward, the girls tried to bury her. When they found that the ground was too hard to dig into, they covered her body with branches and dirt instead. It would be 6 months before her remains were finally discovered. Just hours after the murder, Skylar Nees' parents realized she wasn't in her room and reported her missing. At first, police assumed she had run away, and her friends went along with the news that she disappeared. That morning, Sheila Eddy called Skylar Nees' parents and explained that she and Rachel Shoaf had been with her the night before. She admitted that they had snuck out, picked Nees up around 11 p.m., and then drove around smoking marijuana for a bit before dropping Nees off near her house, just before midnight. Later, security footage would reveal that this timeline was off, as the girls didn't even pick Nees up until well after midnight. Meanwhile, Rachel Shoaf had decided to go on a last-minute boat ride with her mom and her family friend, Kelly Kearns. When Rachel Shoaf's mom, Patricia, brought up the news that Rachel's friend Skylar Nees had been reported missing, Rachel's behavior didn't seem too unusual. I mean, she was texting all the time, Kearns later remembered. But you see so much of that, it didn't really faze us. Then, the day after her best friend supposedly vanished without a trace, Rachel Shoaf left for a 2-week-long church camp. As time went on, it eventually became clear that Rachel Shoaf and Sheila Eddy knew something about Skylar Nees' disappearance. The FBI even got involved, searching the girls' lockers and confiscating their computers. Still, both Shoaf and Eddy stuck to their previous story to a T. Their stories were verbatim, the same. No one's story is exactly the same unless it's rehearsed, one police officer said about the girls. Then, in late December 2012, Rachel Shoaf suffered a nervous breakdown and was briefly admitted to a psychiatric hospital. When she was released in early January 2013, she finally decided to confess, telling police that she and Eddy had planned and executed the murder of Skylar Nees. When asked why they'd done it, she simply said, "We just didn't like her." About 6 months after the disappearance of Skylar Nees, Rachel Shoaf led the police to the area where she and Eddy had hidden the body in Pennsylvania. Eventually, authorities were able to recover the remains. By May 2013, police had enough evidence to arrest both Rachel and Sheila. Those who knew Rachel Shoaf personally were stunned that she could have committed such a brutal murder. There was never any sign. Not a mean kid, not a bully, didn't torture animals, Kelly Kearns said. With all of the potential and morals, I don't even get where this came from. After securing a plea deal, Rachel Shoaf readily pleaded guilty to the second-degree murder of Skylar Nees. In February 2014, she was sentenced to 30 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 10 years. Before her sentencing, she apologized to the Nees family. "The person that did that was not the real me," she said. "I became scared, caught up in something that I did not want to do." Nees' father did not accept Shoaf's apologies. "Rachel Shoaf murdered my daughter in cold blood," Dave Nees said in response. "She can take her apologies and sit on them." Shoaf served the first part of her sentence in a juvenile facility, and she was relocated to a state prison after her 18th birthday. Sheila Eddy, meanwhile, was sentenced to life in prison for first-degree murder, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. While Rachel Shoaf initially claimed she and Sheila Eddy had murdered their friend because they just didn't like her, not everyone was satisfied with that motive. In fact, some theorized that the pair may have had a secret sexual relationship and that they killed Niz because she found out. At her parole hearing in May 2023, Shoaf, then 26, confirmed this theory, claiming she and Eddy had been seeing one another, and they were afraid of what would happen if Niz revealed their secret. After things became known with the relationship, there was tension between us, she said. It was hostile and violent. In our teenage minds, we didn't know how to handle the conflict, and we just wanted it to stop. Skylar Niz's family, however, insisted that she would never have outed her friends. She had other gay friends, they said, and wouldn't have been bothered by their relationship. In a statement to the parole board, Niz's father Dave Niz strongly recommended against granting Shoaf parole. This narcissistic, first-degree, cold-blooded killer is not sorry for the brutal murder of my only child, he wrote in the statement. The date of July 6, 2012 was chosen for a specific reason. You see, this beast wanted the killing out of the way before she left for church camp. Just another task to mark off of her list, like standing over my child saying, "Die," as my baby girl took her last breath, because the evil butcher didn't want to be her friend. Rachel Shoaf was denied parole. She is projected to be released in 2028. On June 28, 2014, Erin Corwin disappeared from her home near Joshua Tree National Park in California. Right up until that fateful day, her life seemed happy, at least from the outside. The 19-year-old Corwin was newly pregnant and had recently married her high school sweetheart, John Corwin, a decorated Marine. But beneath the surface of the expectant mother's seemingly idyllic life was a secret, one that would prove deadly in the end. The baby she was carrying didn't belong to her husband, but instead to her longtime secret lover, Christopher Brandon Lee. And after she vanished, and her body was found at the bottom of a mine shaft a week later, it was Lee who would ultimately confess to her murder. This is the tragic true story of Erin Corwin, the young woman whose secret affair cost her her life. Born Erin Hevelin in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Erin Corwin lived a stereotypically all-American life. She met her future husband, John Corwin, when she was still in high school. They began dating when Erin was just 16 years old, and in proper fashion, John even asked permission from Erin's parents before officially dating her. In November 2012, the pair were married. Less than a year later, in September 2013, John and Erin Corwin lighted out to the Marine base in 29 Palms, California, best known as the home of Joshua Tree National Park. There, the couple quickly became friends with other military couples, including Connor and Aisling Malachi, and Christopher Brandon Lee and his wife Nicole. And it didn't take long for the three pairs of couples to become friends. While their husbands were on duty, Erin, Aisling, and Nicole would stop by each other's apartments for snacks and gossip, wrote Shanna Hogan in her book, Secrets of a Marine's Wife. When John, Connor, and Chris were home, the couples barbecued on the grill outside their complex, or watched movies and TV shows at each other's apartments. Despite this seemingly idyllic rhythm, it didn't take long for things to go horribly wrong for everyone involved. Like many newlywed couples, John and Erin Corwin frequently argued over money. They would often accuse the other of overspending, and their disagreements would often end in screaming matches. But when Erin got pregnant for the first time, the fighting seemed to stop until she miscarried shortly after discovering she was pregnant. With John unable to console his clearly devastated wife, the Corwins began to drift further apart. The Lees, too, were going through trials and tribulations of their own. While Christopher Brandon Lee, on the surface, seemed to be a perfect candidate for the Marine Corps, the reality was much different. At least once, he was reprimanded by a commanding officer for using the rifles and rocket launchers like they were toys. Over time, Chris gained a reputation for being rash and reckless, wrote Hogan. Erin Corwin and Christopher Lee began spending more time together, away from the rest of the group, and away from the watchful eyes of their respective spouses. Before long, the pair were having an affair, and Erin turned up pregnant again. But this time, the baby belonged to her lover, not her husband. On the last day anyone would see her alive, John Corwin recalled the brief but loving conversation he had with his wife. He said, "She had woken up and gotten dressed and gave me a kiss goodbye. She said, 'Hey, I'm heading out for the day and I love you.' I told her, 'I love you too,' and I rolled back over and went to sleep." On June 28, 2014, Erin Corwin disappeared, never to be seen alive again. Shortly thereafter, Christopher Brandon Lee took his wife and daughter to Alaska, where they presumably wanted to live for the rest of their lives. Initially, Erin's mother believed her daughter may have just gotten lost in the vastness of the Joshua Tree National Park, but quickly disabused herself of the notion when Erin's abandoned car was found outside the park a week later. It took 2 months for Erin's body to be recovered, which would ultimately prove to be down an abandoned mine shaft, strangled to death with a handmade garrote. Though Erin Corwin told her friends and family she was pregnant, and that Lee was the father, her body was so badly decomposed that the medical examiner could not confirm her pregnancy. Shortly after her body was found, Christopher Brandon Lee was arrested in Alaska in August 2014. While he initially pleaded not guilty to the crime, he eventually confessed to killing his former lover in August 2016, but insisted that it was because she was molesting his daughter, a claim that has never been substantiated. "I made the decision to kill her," he said. "I was controlled by the anger. The hate I felt that day, it was something I never want to experience again." In November 2016, Christopher Brandon Lee was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Erin Corwin. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Lee appealed his case in 2018, but the California Supreme Court denied it outright, citing Lee's false claim of molestation as their reasoning. He remains behind bars to this day. When Kelly Cochran's husband found out about her affair, he asked her a simple question that had unimaginably gruesome consequences. How would she make up for it? Jason Cochran was satisfied with the answer. He would forgive his wife of 13 years if she lured her lover to their house with the promise of sex, and then allowed her jealous husband to blow the lover's brains out. Kelly Cochran's co-worker and fling, Christopher Regan, was fatally caught off guard. He was mid-coitus when Jason Cochran emerged from the shadows to execute him at point-blank range with a .22 rifle. Moments later, Kelly Cochran was handing her husband a buzzsaw with which to dismember him. Little did Jason know that he would be next. Kelly grew resentful of the 2014 incident and later killed him with a heroin overdose to even the score in 2016. When holes in her story led to her arrest, she claimed Regan's murder was born out of a lethal marital pact. This is the grisly story of Kelly Cochran. Born and raised in Merrillville, Indiana, Kelly and Jason Cochran were high school sweethearts who grew up next door to each other. They were so enamored with each other that they were married after Kelly Cochran graduated from high school in 2002 and made a lifelong promise to kill anyone who they might cheat with. Jason Cochran worked hard servicing swimming pools until his back gave out after 10 years of physical labor. While his wife tried to pay the bills, the debts kept piling up. The couple left Indiana for Caspian, Michigan, in 2013, also looking forward to legal marijuana, which would help ease Jason's chronic pain. Kelly Cochran met Christopher Regan at a factory job manufacturing naval ship parts. An Air Force veteran and Detroit native, he and Cochran bonded and became lovers despite their 20-year age difference. Through his relationship with Cochran, Regan was also cheating on his girlfriend, Terry O'Donnell. They finally agreed to patch things up the day that he died. On October 14, 2014, Chris Regan planned to spend the night with Kelly Cochran, unaware she had spent the previous night arguing with her husband about him. Knowing it meant her lover's death, Cochran invited him over and had sex with him as her husband shot him in the head. Neighbors heard a shot, then power tools. O'Donnell reported Regan missing 10 days later, but the Cochrans had already dumped his remains in the woods. While they parked his car on the outskirts of town, they failed to notice a post-it note with directions to their house inside. Police were more observant and found the car, the note inside, and their suspects. Police paid Jason and Kelly Cochran a visit, finding the former entirely at ease and the latter uncomfortable. They later questioned them separately. Kelly admitted to having an affair with Regan, but claimed she and her husband had an open marriage. Jason, meanwhile, appeared rather aggravated at her infidelity. While the Cochrans had managed to remove all evidence of their crimes and the case went cold, an FBI search of their home in March 2015 prompted the terrified couple to leave town for Hobart, Indiana. It was there, on February 20th, 2016, that suspicions got the better of the couple, and Cochran murdered her husband. When EMTs arrived at the Mississippi Street residence, they found Jason Cochran unresponsive, and Kelly was reportedly disruptive as they attempted to revive him. The EMTs declared Cochran's husband dead of an overdose, unaware that she had deliberately overloaded his heroin fix, then smothered him for good measure. Cochran held a memorial service days later, claiming it was the hardest thing I will ever have to deal with online, while pawning off her belongings. She fled Indiana on April 26th without notifying relatives, and when the Hobart medical examiner realized Jason died of asphyxiation, she became a fugitive. With probable cause, authorities charged her with murder, home invasion, conspiracy to commit bodies, disinterment and mutilation, concealing the death of an individual, lying to a police officer, and accessory to murder after the fact. Even though she was on the run, Cochran unwisely kept in touch with investigators via text. Her messages claimed she was hiding out on the West Coast in an attempt to throw police off course. However, they simply tracked her phone to Wingo, Kentucky, where U.S. Marshals arrested her on April 29th. Finally, Cochran pointed cops to Regan's remains and the murder weapon. Kelly Cochran's trial revealed that she contemplated killing Jason instead of Chris. She felt that he had killed the only good thing I had in my life, adding, "I still hate him." And yes, it was revenge. I evened the score. While serving a life sentence for Christopher Regan's death, she earned another 65 years in April 2018 for killing her husband. Police said she only told her spouse about Regan when he declined a serious relationship, as the diabolical pact would ensure his death. Ultimately, the full extent of Kelly Cochran's crimes only began to reveal themselves while she was in prison. Once news got out that the couple had dismembered Christopher Regan, friends and neighbors came to the stomach-churning revelation that they had very likely eaten Regan's barbecued remains at a cookout hosted by Cochran. Prosecutors also claimed that Cochran had boasted in interviews to killing several other people, and that she may well be a serial killer with up to 9 bodies buried across the Midwest. Regardless, Kelly Cochran will spend the rest of her life behind bars. Angel Maturino Resendiz hopped on and off freight trains to target victims he found close to the railroad. His attacks were distinctive for their brutal blows to victims' heads, often caused by objects found in the victims' own homes. Known as the Railroad Killer, he was at one point the FBI's most wanted fugitive. The FBI linked the railroad killer to at least 15 murders across several states in the 1990s, and only one woman survived to tell the tale after being beaten, raped, and left for dead. And after Angel Maturino, Resendiz escaped capture several times by being voluntarily deported back to Mexico, it would take the combined effort of an FBI task force and the railroad killer's own sister to finally bring him to justice in 1999. Resendiz was born on August 1, 1959, in Puebla, Mexico, as Angel Leoncio Reyes Resendiz. At age 14, he illegally entered Florida before being deported in 1976. In fact, over a 20-year period, Resendiz was deported or voluntarily returned to Mexico 17 times, having illegally entered the U.S. using a series of aliases. Convicted on at least 9 occasions for serious felonies, including burglary, Resendiz would be deported after he served his sentence, then head right back to the U.S. to resume his criminal activities. Drifting back and forth across the border, Resendiz illegally hopped freight trains while working seasonal migrant farm jobs, riding rail cars to Florida for orange picking season or up to Kentucky to harvest tobacco. In 1986, Resendiz killed his first victim, an unidentified homeless woman in Texas, according to the Houston Chronicle. But it wasn't until Resendiz killed 2 teenage runaways in 1997 near railroad tracks in Central Florida that investigators linked those slayings to his previous crimes and realized that they had a serial killer on their hands. On the night of August 29, 1997, in Lexington, Kentucky, young couple Christopher Meyer and Holly Dunn were walking along railway tracks back to a party near the University of Kentucky when Resendiz suddenly emerged from a crouched position behind a metal electrical box, binding the terrified couple's hands and feet and gagging Meyer. Resendiz wandered off, then came back with a large rock, which he dropped on Meyer's head. Resendiz raped Dunn, who stopped struggling when he reportedly told her just how easy it would be for him to kill her. Left viciously beaten by a large object and suffering multiple facial fractures, Dunn became the lone survivor of the railroad killer. Resendiz continued riding the rails and committing murders across several states, with the ferocity of his attacks increasing with each stop. His murder spree was only interrupted when he was detained by the Immigration and Naturalization Service. But once he was free, his killings continued anew. After having beaten 2 elderly women to death in their Texas and Georgia homes, Resendiz entered the Texas home of Claudia Benton late at night on December 17, 1998. Benton was soon found beaten to death with a statue in her bedroom, and Resendiz was far from finished. On May 2, 1999, he entered the Weimar, Texas, home of a pastor and his wife. In their house, situated behind the church and near the railroad tracks, Resendiz beat Norman and Karen Cernick to death with a sledgehammer as they slept, then sexually assaulted Karen. The search for Resendiz received widespread national media attention, even appearing on an episode of America's Most Wanted. The FBI saw similarities between the Benton and Cernick murder scenes, and DNA obtained from both came back as a match. The connected crime scenes were entered into VICAP, the nationwide data information center that collects and analyzes information on violent crimes. The Kentucky murder of Christopher Meyer, which Holly Dunn miraculously survived, seemed to match aspects of the murders of Benton and the Cernicks, and the DNA once again matched as well. The FBI then obtained a federal warrant for Resendiz's arrest in late May 1999 and formed a multi-agency task force to apprehend him. Over an 18-month period, the Immigration and Naturalization Service detained the railroad killer 9 times, but, hiding behind fabricated identities, he was voluntarily returned to Mexico on each occasion. But the Immigration and Naturalization Service's gravest error came on the night of June 1, 1999, according to Justice Department documents. When the railroad killer was detained entering the U.S. in the desert near the Santa Teresa border crossing in New Mexico. Resendiz provided an unused alias and a different date of birth, and with authorities unaware, there was a warrant for his arrest in connection with several murders. Resendiz was voluntarily returned to Mexico the following day. 2 days later, the railroad killer re-entered Texas and savagely committed 4 more murders over the course of just 12 days. On June 4th, the railroad killer killed 2 people in 1 day, sexually assaulting Houston schoolteacher Noemi Dominguez before murdering her with a pickaxe. In her stolen car, Resendiz traveled to Schulenburg, Texas, around 4 miles from Weimar, and the previous Cernik killings. In Schulenburg, he used that same pickaxe to kill 73-year-old Josephine Konvicka, leaving the weapon embedded in Konvicka's head. Moving north, Resendiz next invaded the home of 80-year-old George Morber, just 100 yards from a railroad track in Gorham, Illinois. The railroad killer shot Morber in the back of the head with a shotgun before Morber's 57-year-old daughter, Carolyn Frederick, arrived. And Resendiz didn't spare Frederick, beating her to death, then sexually assaulting her afterward. As dread escalated across communities easily reachable by train, Resendiz was placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list. The FBI task force was stunned to find that Angel Maturino Resendiz had been rounded up and deported 8 times in a mere 18 months. Most unbelievably, on June 2, 1999, when state and federal warrants were out and intensive efforts were underway to catch him. Behind the scenes, the railroad killer's sister worked with Texas Ranger Drew Carter by encouraging her brother to give himself up. She was later awarded $86,000 for aiding in his surrender. On July 13, 1999, Resendiz, accompanied by family, surrendered on an El Paso border crossing bridge, shaking Ranger Carter's hand. The railroad killer's innocuous 5-foot, 190-pound appearance belied the monstrous acts he'd committed. Resendiz was evaluated as mentally disturbed, but not insane at trial, and on May 18, 2000, with survivor Holly Dunn having testified, was convicted for the capital murder of Claudia Benton. Having also confessed to 8 other murders, Resendiz was sentenced to death, following an automatic appeal. On the day of his execution, he asked forgiveness from the family members of his victims in attendance, and from God, for allowing the devil to deceive me, with his final words stating, "I deserve what I am getting." The railroad killer died by lethal injection on June 27, 2006. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe to stay tuned with the latest uploads.